I have not heard, I have not heard from James, so I'm not sure if he's gonna make it or not, but thank you all. So we went through last week kind of a wish list of items we wanted to be able to discuss um, as we're working through this process to make some recommendations to City Council. And the first one was to talk to Evanston Police Department to get a better understanding about when calls come into 911, how they triage those and how they determine, what services need to be dispatched, because we spoke about um, as we kind of redesign or design kind of an alternative response, we wanted to make sure when those calls, if they come through 911, the dispatch, is able to gather their correct information and send out this, potential new host of folks to respond. So we have Christopher Voss. Chris, I don't know your title, so I'm sorry if I'm missing some titles there. Who's going to lead us through a presentation from our 911 team. And he also provided some information that I shared with you all about an hour ago via email. But Chris, if you want to share your screen, if that's easier, you should have the ability to do that as well.
Sure, I'll let you know if I'll be sharing the screen. The title is Acting Communications Coordinator for Evanston.
Okay.
Okay. So
hold on one second, Chris. 1 second.
Sure, no
Jared,
problem.
can you change James? Let's see. Do we need to change James? So
yes, I changed him when he came in.
Okay, thank you.
And Chris should be able to share his screen now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Would you all find it helpful for Chris to share the screen with information? Or Chris, I can do that for you if it's easier for me to do it while you talk.
I can share the screen as I get to a certain point.
Okay. You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm having technical difficulties with my printer. I'm trying to get my notes printed up here, and it just wasn't working. So hold on just a minute here.
All right. Well, while we're waiting, I want to just introduce Angela. She is new to the committee. She was appointed last night. Angela, if you want to just tell us a little bit about, who you are and what you do here in Evanston.
Sure. Hi. I sat in last week, but you couldn't see me. So hello officially. And I am a business owner and resident of Evanston. I have creative co-working on Davis Street. I serve on the board of the Evanston Chamber of Commerce and of the Downtown Evanston organization. So I consider myself to be fairly plugged into the pulse of the business community. So that's what I'm trying to represent here, as well as being a resident.
Perfect. And then we should probably connect you and James. I can do that via email. James is the outreach manager at Connections, and you mentioned just kind of knowing who to call when you all had a resident who might need some assistance, but not necessarily a police response. So if they're homeless, James would be your person for that. So I'll connect you guys via email. All right, Chris, we're ready for you when you're ready.
Okay. Thank you for inviting myself and as well as Linda Thompson to address some of your concerns regarding how we would handle alternate 911 meeting or alternate 911 responses. The deputy chief gave me a kind of a list of talking points that needed to be addressed, and I'll handle them in the order that she provided them to me. One of the requests from the deputy chief was to define how we determine a nuisance complaint. And along those lines, our Communications Bureau Support Services SOP defines that particular nature as a complaint of general nuisance or disturbance of the peace. It's somewhat broad in that language, but examples would include loud music, party complaints, skateboarding on public property, early or after hours, construction, and any loitering or congregating. That would generally meet a nuisance complaint definition. Were there any other questions regarding nuisance complaints that needed to be addressed specific to our definition? No? Okay.
Well, I guess, James, sorry, Christopher, I do have a question. So
yes.
If you get a call for nuisance, that automatically sends an officer out to kind of assess and survey what's happening?
Yes, at this point, we work with the police and fire department almost exclusively for call types. If the nuisance is something that can be handled through another agency or another division of the city, we'll pass that along to them. But that if the nuisance is occurring at the time of the call, then the police would respond. That is correct.
And so would you figure that out just by asking obviously more questions of the caller to try to get an idea of what the nuisance is?
Yeah, generally a nuisance complaint would come to us through the desk or through 311 via the desk. But there are circumstances when they would come to 911. So if the call came to 911, we would either forward them to the non-emergency, or if the caller was adamant that they wanted that information taken on the 911 phone call, then we would take that. We'd ask a series of questions related to what is your nuisance complaint, whether it's loud music, do you know where it's coming from? Is there a house that it's generating from? What's the address? Do you know the people involved? Those kind of things, general questions that give us a better picture of what the nuisance is.
And my last question then is, if they reference a juvenile or a group of kids or whatever, what do you all do then?
The patrol units will respond to the location if it's involving a juvenile, and then the determination will be made if there's a more action needed to be taken. They will contact a juvenile detective if one is available to come and deal with the juvenile. But we don't give it directly to juvenile officers unless there's some need for further action to be taken.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. There was a list of about 19, I believe, call nature service types that were given to me. And one of the questions that, in addressing that was, what time of day are most of these occurring? So I'm going to share this screen with you. Hold on just a moment. Okay, at this point, you all should be seeing a bar chart. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, so I've taken them from most, the highest number of total calls down through the least number of total calls for the 19 specific call types that were given to me. The first one is being a check to well-being. You see the calls for service by time of day starts at 0 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the morning through 2300. And you'll see there's not much in terms of check to well-being early in the day. It does peak middle of the day and then kind of taper back off again as the day gets a little bit longer or as the day goes along. Total for 2019 were 2,029 total calls, and those are calls that are not self-initiated. Self-initiated would mean that called into dispatch by a police officer, not by a citizen. Stop me at any point if you
Can you repeat that, Christopher? I'm sorry. So self-initiated means called in by?
Called in over the radio by a police officer to a dispatcher, saying, hey, put me off with this person. I'm checking their well-being. I see them, maybe sitting on the side of the street, whatever the circumstances might be. An officer in their normal routine might come across something and then advise the dispatchers of what they have. That would be a self-initiated call. So these isolate for non-self-initiated. So all of these represent calls that would be phoned in by citizens.
Okay. And can you give us an idea if someone calls in, what they would say or what you would find out in that call that would trigger this being a check well-being call?
Sure. As a matter of fact, that brings me right to some of the notes. So these have been redacted for information. You won't see the location information or the caller information on these, but they can give you a gist of what's going on when one of those comes in. So these were pulled from some recent calls to give you an idea of some check to well-beings. The first one you'll see, these are the notes that were put into what's known as the CAD event ticket, computer aided dispatching ticket. And for this particular call, it was a request that we check on a 33-year-old female who was suicidal and had taken pills yesterday. She was transported to the hospital, but now was back at home. So the caller in this one was concerned for the well-being of that female. Officers responded to the location and managed to speak to neighbors who advised that that person had spent the night at an unknown downtown Evanston address. And then again, when it says spoke to the resident, this is referring to the actual person that they were checking on. And she stated that she in fact did stay somewhere downtown in Evanston. The friend stated that. And that she would contact the police department if and when that female returned back home. There was a subsequent follow-up call to that location, but I haven't included all of that information here because some of it would be, protected information. If you look at the next one, check the well-being. This one was regarding a 76-year-old female whose family member couldn't get a hold of her. We sent the officers to the location and determined that she was unable to be reached because she was watching the debate and didn't want to be bothered. So that's just another example of a check the well-being call that we recently took. And then sometimes you'll get a check the well-being that originates through 911. These other two originated through the front desk and were dispatched by 911 dispatchers. But you'll get a check the well-being that may come directly to 911. And the third one you'll see on the list is a 911 phone call from a female where the dispatcher was able to ascertain that the female stated, I think she's got into something, and then disconnected. We attempted a call back. She hung up the phone once we made the call back. So we did a Verizon trace on the call. And you'll see, if you notice, that there are timestamps all throughout these, and that's just, and then also a name next to it. That's to tell us which dispatcher is putting in the information and at what time that they put those in. That's information that's in the computer-aided dispatching system, and it allows us to, if we need to, have a conversation with the dispatcher to say, where did you get this information from? It's a nice tool for us. So in that situation, or in that particular one, the officers ascertained that her phone was in emergency mode by accident, and that the police were not needed for anything. Everything was fine. So those are just a few of the check the well-being examples. Any questions regarding those?
Can you clarify for us, Christopher, when you mentioned they come in through the desk, or they come in some other way and are sent over to dispatch? What does that mean?
So the computer-aided dispatching system is a system that both the front desk, the service desk, and the police 911 operators utilize. So they come in and they sign into the system every day. It's how we track calls for service. It's how we track units, police units and fire units. And the desk also signs in every day. So when the desk takes a police-related call, non-emergency call, they may have to put in a call for service, in which case they'll add it in there, and then it routes to the dispatcher in the 911 center.
Okay, so if someone calls 311 or the non-emergency number,
Correct.
Those calls go elsewhere, and then they might decide to send it over to you all to dispatch.
Yeah, if the call ends up at the front desk, non-emergency calls will be entered for service, and then an officer will be sent by a dispatcher, and that's using the CAD system.
Okay.
Okay. And as we go further down, you'll see nuisance complaints. Nuisance complaints tend to taper off significantly overnight, and then begin again as the day gets longer. Especially, you see the highest amount of nuisance complaints are late at night when people are generally wanting to go to bed. That's when they'll call in a nuisance complaint. Disturbances, also again peak, middle of the afternoon, later in the evening. Disturbances are, you could describe disturbances as any kind of disagreement or confrontation that may be between one party and another that escalates beyond just a verbal disagreement, where there's maybe a concern for someone to enact or create a threatening environment. That would be a disturbance. And a domestic disturbance would be anybody involved in a familial situation and also in a disturbance. So mother, father, child and family member, boyfriend, girlfriend, all those would qualify as domestic. Unwanted person, that's a different than a vagrant, different than somebody standing on a corner being a nuisance. An unwanted person is generally categorized as someone that the caller knows and doesn't want in their house, on their property, in their general vicinity, and wants them gone right now. That would be an unwanted person. And there's no rhyme or reason or time of day that's too heavily, out of whack than others. As you see here, it's kind of, it's varied across the board. I used 1900 hours or 7 p.m. is the peak on that one, and I would probably chalk that up to just more people being at home. Vagrant calls. Vagrants, just a catch-all terminology for a homeless person or someone who is hanging around and generally being a nuisance and not leaving, but is known to be either homeless or panhandling. And you'll see 7 a.m. is the highest call or the peak of calls on that. I would imagine that in some ways that has to do with most of the vagrant calls generally are downtown and a lot of times near the L stops. So 7 a.m. you got a lot of people going onto the train. They may call in a vagrant and say, hey, there's somebody. Vagrants do tend to stay in the vicinity of high foot traffic. So I think that would be the reason why 7 a.m. you're seeing a larger number of calls for vagrants than other times of the day.
Can we stop there, if you don't mind, Christopher, and have a little bit of a conversation? I can't see people's faces because the screen share, but so that would be, I would think, for this group, part of the population we would like to service, without an officer. So can you kind of walk us through if someone calls about a vagrant? I know you said that they won't move along, but
Sure.
what are the kind of, if I go to the train and there's a homeless person there, they're not blocking the door, harassing me, I guess.
Right.
About them having to move along. I mean, we have.
You kind of broke up there a little bit. You said they're blocking, they're not.
Well, like if they're not stopping me from getting on the train or blocking the train, the access to the train, Evanston Davis Street.
Sure.
And they're sitting on a bench for the bus. What would kind of, for you all as the police, what justifies that they need to move on versus just sitting on the bench?
Well, if you notice, I'm screen sharing now a couple of the vagrant calls to give you an idea of the notes that kind of lead to that. The first one mentions that there was a male white 5'11" baseball cap, gray hoodie, and a backpack with blue jeans who's refusing to leave. That particular one was for a business. So the caller had asked for an officer to come and take that person away from the business. Now, if you also see that the follow-up on that was that the caller refused police assistance. So I'm not 100% sure why the caller refused police assistance after calling us there. But that's just one example of where vagrant might be used as the nature on that one. And I'm sorry, that's the second one, not the first one. It's a little confusing where it says vagrant down below is actually, it's referring to, the way this report put together is a little confusing. The one up above that is the caller is a building owner, and that it was called by 2 tenants who were complaining of a male black sleeping in the front vestibule of the building. That would be an example where we would be sending an officer to move that person along because they are on private property. So that does meet the qualification for the need for someone to move along. That subject did agree to move along and refused to take any information on housing and refused to give any information, further information to the officer, which is their prerogative and their right. The next one down there, a little further down, it says there's a homeless subject sleeping in the building. The subject and then subsequently was moved along. That was a homeless subject sleeping in a city building. That particular phone call. And then the last one, that one was called in third party on information that there was a male in the lobby loitering and then heading up the stairs to the lobby and needed to be escorted away. So at that point, officers responded, subject left, advised, and complied. So you'll see in many cases that what reaches the level of necessary in the eyes of the caller is the person may be in a building, or the person may be refusing to leave when they're asking. These are just a small example of calls. I only went over a couple of days to kind of pull these calls, to pull notes from them. Like we could get far deeper into them. However, I think that would take a much longer time to kind of parse those out. So again, it's kind of a long way of answering your question, in that why would an officer be sent? Generally, if a person's saying that this person is entering the building or refusing to leave a location that they're not allowed to be in, then an officer is definitely going to respond. There are calls where the request is that somebody leave a public area, and that's a conversation that we need to ascertain what crime is being committed at that point when a person's in a public area, and that may reach, the caller may say that the subject is panhandling, maybe panhandling aggressively, whatever the case may be in that circumstance, the questions will be asked. Because you can't just call and say, we need this person to move along. The caller's got to give a reasoning for moving a person along. And then the officer will then be sent to determine if any crime is being committed at that point, or if any justification is necessary to move the person along.
Does anyone else have questions about this subject matter before he continues?
This is Maureen. I thank you so much for all of this detail, Chris. It's really helpful to get a sense of what's happening. And thank you for pointing out the dates, because then I noticed this is all just from a couple of days. And so I did wonder if calls, particularly around vagrancy and like people sleeping in doorways and stuff, is that somewhat seasonal? Do you find that those calls are more like when the weather starts to turn, or is it pretty much all the time?
Keep in mind that I haven't worked behind the council in 4 years. I do supervise
Sure.
everybody in the dispatch center, but from my experience working behind the council, yes, that in the summertime, I would say it's generally a less number of calls regarding vagrants than in the wintertime. And it's a higher probability that somebody is going to be in a foyer in the time, for sure. I think that's not off base to say.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So when an officer responds to a call about a vagrant, so they move the person along and then that's kind of the end of the interaction, or? They
Depends.
they watch the person walk down the block, or what's the aftermath, I guess?
I can't speak to that with 100% accuracy because we only know what the officer provides them in the disposition as to if it says that the officer moved the person along. I can't speak to whether or not that person walked down the street or was put onto a train to go somewhere else, or the officers will generally tell you if they took the person to a shelter, and that does happen often. A shelter over at 1458 Chicago is very accommodating to many of the homeless people in town, but at some point they don't have enough beds.
Right.
So to that end, it's an unfortunate thing that sometimes we don't know more about where they go after they move along.
Right.
Christopher, are you all, I know you have data in the call there, but are you able to help us understand if any of these calls are juveniles?
We could
that too
know if
hard
they're
to-
juvenile based on if they were run through the system, through dispatch to check for either address information, or if they're missing. Officers will run people to make sure that they're not missing, if they appear to be lost or confused, to try to find an address. We can also use that information to maybe even find phone numbers. If that information is included to us, then yes, we would know whether or not there was a juvenile involved in the situation. And in the event that they needed to help a juvenile find another location to stay for the evening, then the Juvenile Detective Bureau would 9 times out of 10 or more so get involved in that.
And James, can you pop in to answer the question that Alderman Ravel asked about kind of the follow-up, since that's what you do? Do you get a lot of calls from EPD when they're answering these calls and they need some more support, or somebody does say, yes, I would like some information on housing? Are you getting calls?
Yeah, we do answer calls. Currently, we have 2 outreach specialists, and we're in the process of trying to hire a third, actually a fourth also, but that one would be connected to our juvenile division, our youth division. But anyway, so one of the problems we have right now is that our capacity to shelter people is at capacity. We have all the people sheltered that we can possibly shelter right now. However, we do have more information, about where they might be able to go in Chicago or North Suburban pads, but we do respond, and we do get calls from Everson Police Department. We try to respond to them. And I know that on November the 8th, Interfaith Action of Everson will be opening their overnight emergency shelters. And those will be open from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. But our outreach specialists should be out there giving out cards to vagrant people, unhoused people, and to police officers when they meet them. I believe several Everson Police Department police officers, as well as Northwestern police officers, have been given my card at one time or another.
And to address that as well, we do have an updated list of warming shelters available that is passed along on a weekly basis, so that our dispatchers can contact whatever church or agency is available to take people in for that evening, and officers are conveyed that information.
And just to add to your specific question about whether these calls involve juveniles or not, That's one of the basic questions that we ask on every single call. Is it an adult? Is it a child? You know, and most of our callers tend to be pretty accurate with guessing that. So a lot of times we can tell from the get-go if we're going to be dealing with a juvenile or an adult before the call's even dispatched. So if that's something where we would want to call and a lot of times we do call over to the juvenile detective bureau and say, hey, heads up, we've got a call involving a juvenile that you might want to get involved with. So those calls tend to get referred to the juvenile detectives right away, very early on, before the officer even responds.
Thank you, Linda.
And then I think my last question, and feel free everybody to jump in here, was I would imagine there's a lot of overlap in all of these calls when you start factoring in substance abuse or mental health needs. And so can you talk us through, I don't know if that's ever identified by the caller or it's just something that's observed by the officer when they get there. What is the response there? If there's not a, you know, I guess crime involved, what is the response there in terms of any resources or any agencies that you might be reaching out to for support?
Well, in reference to mental health related calls, if there's concerns and it's conveyed to the dispatchers that there's a mental health concern, then that is factored in to the response. The vast majority, I believe it may be close to 90% of officers at this point have taken crisis intervention training, and our dispatchers know who is a crisis intervention trained officer and who isn't. It's on the daily roster. So their expectation is to send a crisis intervention trained officer to any call where they know mental health may be a factor. That includes suicide and suicide ideations and substance abuse if it's conveyed. Recently, dispatchers completed a lesson, a continuing education lesson involving verbal calming techniques and de-escalation during call taking. And that's just another example of how we're proactive in making sure that our dispatchers are up to speed on what is necessary to have a conversation with someone who may be having a mental health breakdown. Because they may not convey that to you, but it may be conveyed through their speech and through the manner in which they're conveying their emergency. And then again, we also track mental health related calls are dispatched, or I'm sorry, dispositioned with specific disposition codes for tracking purposes. So the call may come in as one particular call type, and the officer determines once they go that this is related to mental health. So they'll code that particular call with a disposition code specific to mental health related. That way, the right people for following up can be given the information, and follow up can be they can seek follow-up, is what I meant to say.
So are those numbers you can share with us in terms of the mental health identifiers?
I can share the numbers of how many calls in 2009 were dispositioned as a mental health related call.
Okay.
And that is 509 of them. Again, isolating for self-initiation. So that would be, again, called in. So 509 were dispositioned with that special mental health disposition code. And that's out of 33,280 total calls for service. So it represents 1.5%. Keep in mind that this is police related tracking. It's hard to quantify how many mental health related phone calls resulted in a fire related response, an EMS related response, because you'll get a lot of calls where people are having, they need the fire department for help to go to the hospital that could well be related to substance abuse or mental health or something along those lines. And in those circumstances, a police officer may not have even responded.
And is that something you all are asking? If there's substance abuse or mental health?
If we're asking if there's substance abuse or
Yeah.
mental health, if the line of questioning leads you to need to ask that, then yes. But if the emergency is not something that is mental health related in its situation, then that's not a line of questioning that generally would need to be asked. It's a presumptive question to ask if somebody has mental health issues if they're calling about an emergency that has nothing to do with mental health. So that's not a line of questioning that would be asked. Now, we do have a number of people who are, we'll call them regular callers, who we are aware of mental health issues, and we do mention that generally in the notes of the event to say that this is a regular caller. The caller in the past has had these mental health issues, and again, that is assigned to a crisis intervention trained officer if a crisis intervention trained officer is available.
Any more questions from the committee? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Pat.
yes. Hi, this is Patty. I just have a quick question. So I understand, could you tell me what percentage have had the crisis intervention training of the officers?
I don't know the true numbers on that. I know that it was mentioned a couple of months ago. I think in August during the Human Services Committee, I want to say it was nearing 90%. I'd have to get that
Okay,
to get the accurate number.
great, thank you. And then one just follow-up question to that. So when the dispatch, you'd said that they have a daily roster then of who the officers are. So then when called into dispatch, do the dispatchers then, how do they know what's the criteria to sort of triage them to the crisis intervention trained officers instead of just a regular? Do they have like a checklist or how does that work?
It's about availability in a lot of ways, and Linda would correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have a roster of 10 officers, just using 10 as the number, and 8 of the 10 are crisis intervention trained, and a call comes in that needs their particular expertise, it's about availability, it's about location, it's about how many officers need to respond to that particular call type. Certain call types require one officer, certain call types require more than one officer. And then it's incumbent upon the dispatcher to determine, okay, am I going to send this particular officer across town because he's crisis intervention trained? And if it's necessary, then yes, that's what will happen. I mean, is that a fairly accurate assessment, Linda?
Yeah, definitely. It's just part of our daily routine. It sounds maybe a little more complicated than it is, but we're really, it's just part of our process when we dispatch any call.
Okay.
Finding the closest office.
Oh, sorry, you're muted. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just finding the closest officer as well as the one that's best able to handle the call, which, I mean, they're all very qualified. So it's not hard to find somebody. And if it is a call where we think, perhaps this person's having a mental episode and they're destroying their house and fighting with the family and they can't get them under control, we know we have to send more than one officer to that. So I'm going to make sure at least one of the ones that's going is crisis trained. But if they're coming from further away, I may have to send a couple that aren't, just to get there faster and get the scene under control.
Okay. I appreciate this. I run an organization for, our folks have serious and chronic mental illness. So that's why I'm asking all the questions around it. So are the dispatchers then, do they do any of that crisis training so that they have an idea of what the needs might be?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
We take, dispatchers do at minimum 24 hours of continuing education every year. That's by state mandate. We contract through 2 companies to provide that. Each of them provides 12 hours. So they take 2 hours a month, and most of that is geared towards, well, almost all of it is geared towards call taking. And it kind of splits between medical call taking and then police call taking. And they have taken, as a matter of fact, there was a number of recent lessons that were given at no extra cost once COVID came. The COVID situation started, that specifically dealt with suicidal callers that were having trouble dealing with the circumstances. And then also, not just them, but also dispatcher mental health. What kind of things are you doing to make sure that you, as the dispatcher and call taker, are keeping tabs on your own mental health? Because that
Good.
can be something that we can all get into. We could all focus on that for sure. And that was something that there were 4 lessons that they all took that covered those. And like I said, they recently took the de-escalation and verbal calming techniques training. So we try to keep them engaged in every aspect of their job. And like Linda said, sometimes it sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. It's really not. We just want to make sure that we're providing the best service possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well,
Can I ask a quick question? That's all really helpful. And I know you said in regards to the dispatchers, they have 24 hours of continuing education per year. Do you know in regards to the officers that are being dispatched and who are crisis intervention trained, is that like a one-time 40-hour crisis intervention class? Or is there continuing education around that for the officers that are out on the streets too, not just dispatch?
Well, I'd probably defer to the deputy chief to answer with 100% accuracy, but I know for a fact that the officers are taking many hours of training throughout the year, and following up, constantly keeping themselves up to date on their training.
Okay, thank you.
DC Barnes, can you answer? Do you know if that's is that a state mandatory training? Is that an Evanston mandated training? Is there refresher courses on that?
As far as the de-escalation training,
Yeah, for the crisis intervention, yes.
yes, it is mandated.
But do you remember if it's like every year, every other year, or just one and done?
I think it's a refresher, but I can get the true answer for that for you easily.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Just a question for either Deputy Chief Barnes or Mr. Vos. Is some crisis intervention training mandated for all Everson police departments or just certain ones?
I mean, it's mandated for dispatchers. The crisis call taking is mandated for dispatchers. And like I said, they follow up every year with the continuing education. I'll let Deputy Chief Barnes speak to the officer's side of it.
Yeah. Sure. So if it's a state mandate, then it would be for all police departments.
Okay. Was that the end of your slides, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the rest of the slides go into just more nature codes. Were there any in particular that you wanted to discuss or take a look at calls for service time of day?
No, I think you provided me the slides and I'll send them to the group so we can take a look.
Sure.
I think we probably, as we figure out what this program is going to be, the times are really important because we don't anticipate having enough money for 24-hour coverage. And so figuring out if it's, nights or weekends or what that is. And it looks like some of that fluctuates. So we'll have to, make our best assumptions with some of the things. But that will be helpful as we look at those charts, trying to figure out, and then whatever you can get us, if there's any way to get any more information about the mental health component, that would be helpful as well, just so we can figure out, as we're designing a program, what might be helpful and necessary.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And then for the crisis intervention, Linda, you mentioned this, so you have a board of who's trained and on the board. But I imagine these are just, I'll say regular because they're not specialized officers, and so they would work a variety of shifts.
Correct, but every shift that comes on, we get a roster of who's going to be here for the next 8 hours. And so we've got their position in the city, what role they're playing that day, and then right next to their name, it'll say CIT. So I know that's a crisis officer. And it really is kind of something that we don't even have to think about. We're all used to dealing with calls that require it and who to send when we need to send someone.
What'd you say?
Do you usually have someone on each shift?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have, say there's 12 officers on the street, at least 6 of the 12 will be crisis officers.
Okay.
So it's not, I have yet to run into a problem where I can't get somebody to a call where they're needed if there's a crisis situation.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Eleanor.
So there are a couple of categories, the involuntary committal and then voluntary committal. Can you talk a little bit about those two kinds of calls?
Sure. Basically, it typically involves someone who is having a mental health issue of some sort. And basically involuntary means they don't choose to go themselves, but they either present enough qualifiers that the officer is able to say, we need to take you to the hospital for your own well-being, or a family member or a doctor is saying, I'm going to sign them in. So it's basically just the difference is them going on their free will or someone else saying, no, you need to go because you're not in a good place right now. And a lot of times those calls, when they come into us, we can sometimes determine if it's if it's going to be voluntary or sometimes involuntary. And that's where Chris was talking about how some of these mental health calls may not even show up in the system and populate as mental health related because people are calling for themselves and just saying, hey, I've got a problem with depression. I think my meds are off. Can someone take me to the hospital? Where they're willing to go, we're not going to send a police officer because that's not necessary. So,
and to double down on what Linda was saying, it's not 100% of the time that a police officer is going to go to a mental health related call. Somebody, like Linda said, somebody may say, I'm not feeling right today. We'll determine whether or not that person is actively going to attempt suicide. We ask a series of questions to try to pull out of them. Do you have a weapon available? Do you have a weapon on you? Have you attempted? Those type of questions. And then if we feel comfortable enough that we can send just the fire department to transport them to the hospital, then we'll do that. But if there isn't a level of comfort based on the response that we receive from that person, then we need to be cautious and we will send an officer. We have a duty to protect the citizens as well as our first responders. So our questions have to be geared with that as the number one factor. Is we need to keep as many people involved in all of our situations free from home. So in our we have over 200 years worth of on-the-job experience in dispatch between 16 people, and they're excellent at what they do when it comes to determining what kind of response we need.
So the call could start out sounding like it's a well-being check, but when the officer gets there.
Yeah. A lot of times that's the, all the police calls start with a initial nature code, which is what we think we're sending you to. And then it gets dispositioned at the end of the incident as what it actually was.
Okay.
So a lot of times, yes, like a check well-being, it could turn into a death investigation. If, you know, someone hasn't spoken to their elderly relative in a while and we check on them and they had passed away. Or then that's when we might say there's a disturbance. There's a disturbance at a house. The neighbors calling, they can just hear their neighbors are fighting. That's all we got. So we send them over there and it turns out they say, hey, can we have an ambulance for a voluntary committal? One of the parties involved needs to go get some help. Or maybe they need to go, maybe they're intoxicated and they need to go into detox. So it can definitely, calls tend to change in nature from beginning to end. So that is something that we have to take into consideration, and we can't just take everything for face value as to what the caller is telling us, because either they don't know or maybe they're not doing a great job of telling us exactly what's going on.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Linda, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because really the calls for service, as I showed them to you earlier, those are as they closed out, as the call closed out. So an involuntary committal very well could have started as a disturbance. It could have started as a nuisance complaint. You know, the information that we received from somebody was someone's hanging out on the corner, you know, acting as a nuisance, and then an officer goes, responds to the location to find out what's going on, and the person reacts, you know, negatively. And then it's determined that they need professional help, so they're taken to the hospital.
All right, well, thank you all for all that information and the charts, of which I did send to the committee earlier. I think that really helped us as we're trying to move forward in our process. You seem very, very well trained and very sophisticated. If we, you know, can develop another response protocol for you all, just another tool for you all to be able to use, you know, with a specialized skill set. So thank you so much for that. And we might revisit and have more questions for you all later as we kind of are learning our way through this.
Sure.
But I really appreciate the thoroughness of that presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And please, you know, let me know if you have any other questions. As I mentioned to Alderman Braithwaite, who is on the 911 board, and so is Rue Simmons. I open up the offer to anybody who wants to come and see the operations in 911 at any point in time. My office is open. Give me a call, and we'll give you a rundown of what we do.
That might be really instructive for us.
Yeah.
We're here
Well,
24/7.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you. Feel free to stay in or disconnect. We'll chat for a few more minutes before our meeting wraps up.
The deputy chief, actually, she accidentally got kicked off of it, but she came into my office. She wants to clarify something. So
Okay.
here she is.
Hi. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that for the mandate for the training, that mental health awareness is a mandate, but not the crisis intervention training or the de-escalation training. So I wanted to follow up with the answer for that.
All right. Oh, go ahead, James.
No, I was just thanking, saying thank you for that, and thank you for all the members of Everson Police Department for enlightening us today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome.
All right, committee. So that was a ton of information, but I think very helpful because it seems like when we get to the point of rolling out our new response, that dispatch is going to be, very well versed and know exactly how to dispatch these new folks that we bring on. Just looking at my notes for what else we had on our list here, that of course is not right in front of me. We talked about having a presentation from the youth and young adult division. And I think we had them paired with maybe, let's see, victim services. I'm just gonna go over our little list that we made, and you guys can let me know if you think one is a priority over another, just as I start scheduling the speakers. So the mental health task force, which is part of the mayor's COVID-19 committee, we have Evanston Fire Department and AMITA to get an understanding of how the AMITA helpline, I guess it's called crisis line, works, as well as the fire department has a response that's a kind of alternative response for them. We talked about the Kahoot, STAR, and the other models that kind of have maybe what we're looking to create here. Youth and young adults pair it with victim services to understand what their response is. And let's see, I have on here substance abuse, although I'm not exactly sure what I meant by that. So I would think that maybe the Kahoots and STAR and the other kind of program models might come towards the end of our information gathering, because then we can have an idea of maybe replication or using part of that. So would you all want to go with the, I can try for the META crisis team, or not crisis team, crisis line folks, and the fire chief, or I could go with the youth and young adult and victim services. Does anyone have a preference?
For me, they're both important, and I think it might just be as much as scheduling as,
Right. Okay.
So I don't have a preference in order.
Okay.
Yeah.
Patty, you turned your mic on. Did you have anything?
Yeah, I basically was going to say I would like to hear from both as well. So I think that
Okay.
Yeah.
So I will go forward and schedule just based on whoever's available on whatever Tuesday. I will also, we have Nicola and Indira who are kind of sharing the work of being staff for this committee. But there's a few things that, you all have sent me, and a few things that I've gathered just that have been floating around in the ethernet about what we're trying to do. And so I'm going to see about just plugging those into our website. So there's a link on the City of Evanston. If you go under agendas and minutes, we're listed there under human services. I can email it to you as well, but I don't want to overwhelm you with emails. But maybe just kind of some reference documents there if you would like to read in your spare time. I know we're meeting weekly, but we're not meeting for that long. And as kind of the world revolves and lots of communities are thinking about response models, I've just been trying to keep a hold of news articles and such. So I'll dump those in there. I've also talked to a couple of aldermen in the city of Chicago. They are trying to get to this point where we are with the committee. The committee so far is not getting a lot of traction with the mayor's office. The mayor's office is committed to a co-response model, so a social worker and a police officer, which is not maybe what everyone wants. So I've just kind of been talking to them to see where they are. They're also looking at, I think, a 211 separate phone line, which I think our 311 and 911 are just great. So I don't think we need all that. But I'll just keep you posted as I am kind of out in the world digging around with information. I know Angela mentioned wanting to connect with James or someone to have an alternative response when you are finding homeless folks or folks who might need assistance downtown. So I can make sure I can connect you guys via email, but if there's other resources that you guys know are currently around that we just want to make sure people in the community know about until we get kind of up and running, feel free to email it to me and I can put it in that same kind of shared drive and make sure we get it out to our community at large as well. I think that is all that I had on my side. Do we have anything else we want to add? Or do you want me to look into anything else that I can share with you guys for next time?
I just am really happy with the information we got today. I think that made me feel a lot better, especially about the dispatcher training, because that was a question we had when we first met, how they could triage things. So I feel a lot better about that. So thanks for setting that up.
Yeah, that was DC Barnes. So yeah, that was very helpful. We had a little bit of that, I think, Eleanor, didn't we, in Human Services, but this seemed, I think the graphs for me were really helpful to see the times a day.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really helpful today. Yeah.
For me, as we were talking about the different situations, like that was really helpful to try like visualize, what was happening. And it made me think that, there are going to be some situations where the dispatcher could actually send a non-uniform, non-armed person to deal with the situation. But then also there's a real opportunity for the follow-up, because a lot of times with the police response is about like what can happen in that moment,
Right.
And getting things calmed down and getting everybody safe. But then it's like, well, then what happens next? And I think a lot of with the hollowing out of just social services generally in our world in the last 20 years, like we've all lost the capacity to do that. And so we need some way, to navigate it. So like now as I'm listening, I'm thinking about almost like two different stages of opportunity. Because I think there's what can we do to keep that situation from, exploding the next time as well. So I don't know what we'll be able to do with the first round of resources that you all have garnered, but that was sort of what I got out of today in my shaping my own thinking.
Yeah. Yes, Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick thing I've been doing some reading just to try to catch up on everything. And, like a phrase that kept coming up was the idea of help without handcuffs, and making sure that there are ways that we're responding that aren't always, uniformed officers, which I know is the goal. And well, in certain circumstances. And then just the other idea being that, a 911 number, there are some people who are never going to call 911, even if they need it. Or even 311 if it's assumed to be just a lesser version of 911. So, the idea of having a very, a number that is strictly for mental health issues that everybody knows off the top of their heads, that they don't have to look it up. That to me, that would be a goal, is to come up with that quick response number that isn't going to involve a uniformed officer.
That's a great, and I think that's what Chicago's thinking with the 211, but I think that that's a great point, because as much as I've thought about having, another response available, you're right. If people are still too upset or, scared to call 911, they can't even access this other response model, right? And
right.
And if you're right, I think people think 311 that I know, potholes and trash and, very operational kind of functions of the city.
Right.
So maybe that's a conversation, and I'm happy to bring that up with Luke Stowe, who's our IT director. I have no idea how hard it is, or if there's a need for something like a 211, or if it's really easy to plug that in and it still goes to 311. They just say something different when they answer. I have no idea. But I think even the mental health task force has really looked at, they have a whole social media campaign just around mental health awareness and, kind of it's okay to not be okay kind of a campaign. So that might be something that ties all in with the whole Aunt Bertha and the whole thing of trying to garner all of our social services in one place. And knowing that the need is going to increase as we continue through the pandemic and even come out of the pandemic. So that's a great point. I will write that down to see what the options are there. And lastly, before we wrap up, Indira was so kind to remind me the next Tuesday is election day. So I don't know how stressed we might be about trying to meet, or if this is a good break for us. So I am happy to meet on, Wednesday next week if you all are going to be tied to, whatever news outlet you watch, midday next week, or going to vote. Or if you all want to skip a week, we can do that. I'm happy to make accommodations, whatever works for us. We're a small group.
Well, there won't be any news yet at 3:30 in the afternoon.
No, but some people, they're glued to the TV. They can't, you got to see the ticker every.
So I can meet next Tuesday. I can also meet Wednesday. We probably need to juggle everybody's schedules slightly. So we'll, so I'm trying to keep myself busy next Tuesday. That's my plan. I'm just sharing from a mental health perspective. If I can't do anything else, I'm cleaning out every closet in my house.
Was there anyone who would rather not meet on Tuesday? Okay, so then we'll go for Tuesday. All right, and then I will let you all know. So this link, and I could just be that the link didn't work, but the link that we have is supposed to be our link for every week. If it didn't work for you all, just send me a note and I'll make sure we get the correct link.
Well, there was a link that you sent, and then there was the link that was on the website. And the link on the website is what I ended up using.
So the link on the website is for public access. So the way we're trying to do this, just to keep the chatter down, is that we would have a link that we're on as panelists. And so that's why you only see our faces here.
Right.
And then
I
people
wanted a password, and I they didn't like my password, and so.
waited. So yeah, because the link on the have to register, and then it says if you want to have public comment, kind of check a box. So we will get that all situated. We're trying to do this as a webinar so you don't have 100 small boxes on your screen, like we are at City Council. Well, we'll work through it. So I will get those documents up for you all. I'll get you it. I'll have one email, the documents and the agenda for next week, and then whatever the link is going to be for us to use every week.
Okay.
All right. So thank you all for your patience. Thank you for participating.
Yeah, well, thank you, Cicely.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate
Have a
it.
good week, everyone.
You
Have a
too.
good week.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.